Hello everyone and welcome back. It has been a hot minute since the last time I recorded. Mainly because I was sick for a while. And also school's been crazy and school is still crazy, but I've finally found time to record again, so here we are. I am really excited for this chapter because it is going to change things dramatically. So let's get started. Chapter 17. Adyen. Sighing, I rolled over, wincing as my shoulder dug into the hard stone of the floor. Cold seeped through the fabric of my shirt, and one entire side of my face felt bruised and swollen. Lars must have gotten pretty rough again during our last interrogation session. No. Wait. I sat up straight, glancing wildly around my cell. Lars Alfred had been here. He'd come into the cell with his men, and he'd... Oh no. The memories were coming back. Someone had been killed. Lars had given me one last chance to tell him where Aster was, and I'd refused. I'd made my choice. And so he'd poisoned me in an attempt to take my powers. In fact, I'd been certain I'd never wake up again after the liquid had knocked me out. But here I was, and oddly enough, I felt fine. I didn't feel sick or crampy or like there was ice or fire in my veins. I was alive. But I wasn't a fool. I wasn't about to believe that just because I'd woken up again, I was in the clear. The poison could still be seeping through me, only to lash out in the last seconds, when it was too late. I had to act like I was running out of time, and do what I could to foil Lars Alfred and his plans while I could. Which meant getting out of this cell. My wrists felt oddly light as I rose to my feet, and I frowned at them in confusion for a moment before I realized. I was no longer shackled. No sound of chains accompanied my movements. That doesn't make sense. Why would they choose to unchain me now? Did they perhaps believe the poison would do its work quickly enough that I would be gone by now? I moved over to the door and tested it. Still locked. Of course. I listened for a moment, and all I could hear was the normal prison sounds I'd become used to during my stay. Dripping water, and not much else. Turning my back on the door, I strode back across the cell to the unusual window that provided my only source of light. Again, no bars, only glass that could easily be broken. I tried peering out of it before, but I couldn't see anything past the cavern plants growing in front of it. Going through it could introduce me to either a covered escape or a quick discovery, but that uncertainty wasn't about to stop me. Now was the time the Darkhearts had made their mistake. Now was my time to escape. So long as I got back to Aster and Talia, everything would be okay. Melia would be able to figure out how to counteract the poison, if that was indeed what it was, and then we could run forever. So long, Lars Alfred. I traversed my way over to yet another wall, where I felt along it until I found the chains that had once bound me. Trying to keep them as quiet as possible, I carefully ran one end out of the metal loop that kept them attached to the wall. The sound of the links clanking together sounded far too loud, particularly in this small space, and more than once I paused, listening over my shoulder in frozen anticipation for the sound of footsteps, approaching to see what was going on in here. I was certain the guards wouldn't come back until it would to check up on me until Lars was ready to siphon away my power and give it to someone else, but no one had ever said that moment couldn't be right now. I never heard anything. Chains in hand, I crossed back to the window, keeping a few steps back. Gathering the links up in my arms, I tossed them at the window with all the strength I possessed. Glass shattered with a crash as shards cascaded from the gap to the floor. I stood there frozen, my heart beating wildly within my chest as I waited for my escape attempt to be discovered right then and there. I was certain there had to be at least a few Darkheart members on alert. I'd be suspicious if there wasn't. Again, nothing. Only the gentle drip of water. I didn't even hear any other chain rattles from the other prisoners. They could be laying a trap. But trap or no trap, I had a chance to get out and I was going to take it. Perhaps if I moved fast enough, I would be able to avoid the worst of whatever the Darkhearts had planned for me. I cleared away a few remaining shards of glass from the edges of the window so I wouldn't cut myself, setting them carefully on the ground so they wouldn't make any more noise. Then I heaved myself up onto the windowsill and set about the work of fitting myself through the window. Aster would have slipped through easily, without any worry of getting stuck. But my shoulders were broader than hers, and overall I had a thicker limbs and torso. I decided to go legs first, hanging onto the top of the windowsill for balance, and to avoid getting my arms stuck. Besides, if the cavern plants were thicker than anticipated, then I wouldn't be running into them with my face. The plants yielded easily enough as my shoes explored them, and wrapping my feet around two of the thick stems, some rocking back and forth got my legs and most of my body through in one go. But the moment of truth was still to come. From this position, my arms were raised above my head, which made my profile a little smaller, and therefore easier to pass through the window. But it was possible I'd miscalculated the proportions of the window with myself, and something was going to get stuck. It had to. I wasn't expecting this escape to be without its challenges. More rocking back and forth to gain momentum, and then I slid through without an inch to spare, and seconds later found myself sitting on the ground outside my cell. And outside the building. I stayed there for a moment, breathing in the smell of the cavern plants, untainted by my own stench that I'd been cooped up with for the past week or more. I was going to wash up very thoroughly once I got home. I wonder how the others will react when I walk through the front door, I mused myself. Aster will probably try to kill me, and Talia will be very surprised. Luckily, it would be a good surprise for all involved. Taking a deep breath, I crawled through the plants towards freedom. For once, I was glad we lived underground. The natural darkness would go a long way towards concealing me as I found my way out. I quickly cleared the plants and found myself in a wide courtyard surrounded by a high stone wall, the posts decorated with a sculptured flourish that made it seem ridiculously grandiose. Behind me stood a manor house, within the basement of which I must have been imprisoned, and I caught sight of the wrought iron gate, glinting slightly in the light of the lanterns outside. I just had to make it through that gate, and then I could disappear into the city. Scanning both the building and the courtyard for guards, I started crawling forward, staying as close to the ground as possible where there was less light and where I could be seen less easily. I spotted at least 2 men patrolling the courtyard itself, and I was certain there would be more at the gate. Run for it. That was all I could do. I hung back in the shadows, watching the men for a few minutes so I could spot a moment when they were both gone and I would have a clear path to the gate. Hopefully it wouldn't be locked, and hopefully no one would be looking out of the windows at the wrong moment. That was a lot of hopes. I shook my head at myself. One thing at a time. Then we would see how things turned out. The guards passed one another and kept walking in opposite directions. While their backs were turned, I crept out of the shadows and darted quietly across the open ground to the wall. The shadows there were deep, and I pressed my back against the stone. Now for the final hurdle. The gate. I estimated that I had maybe a minute left before the guards came back. I decided to cut it down to 45 seconds to give myself some margin for error. If all went well, I would be long gone by the time Lars Alfred and his goons came back to check on me in my cell. As I crept closer to the gates, I realized they were being guarded as well, by 2 more men who had no intention of moving. If I tried to go through that way, I would be caught within seconds, and the consequences would be severe. Lars was not a man who messed around. Quickly, I considered my options. I could try to scale the wall. I immediately backed up so I could make an attempt, but there were no places to get good hand and foot holds, and I had to give that up before I started making too much noise. That left me with two other options. Either I could try to walk out like I owned the place, which would never work, because everyone here who knew who I was knew I was supposed to be a prisoner right now. My other option was to charge through and be gone before they even knew what was happening. However, that could also fail if the gates turned out to be locked. But that also happened to be a chance I was willing to take. All right, Adyen. Prepare to act like a crazy person. This was probably the least sneaky and most likely to wake up everyone in the area option I had, but in reality, there were no good options. At least this one got me away from the dark hearts. Let's go. Letting out an ear-splitting yell to conquer any fear I had lying around inside me, I leapt out of the shadows and charged straight at the gate. Startled shouts of alarm rose from several places around me, but I didn't slow as my hands connected with the gate. I paused for barely a split second as my hand fumbled for the latch and drew it back easily. Flinging the gates open, I raced through, barely avoiding the reaching grasps of the men on the other side. Within seconds, I was out of the property and racing down the cobblestone street, where the darkness swallowed me up.